The Big GP Consultation is a project that's looking at the future of general practice. And in this episode, I'm joined by the team who've been doing this work to basically understand what is in our future in general practice and how this can apply to Innovate and the AiTs and how it can help them hopefully have a more productive and fulfilling career. Let's have a look, shall we now? Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Innovate podcast. And in this episode, I'm really happy to be joined by the team from the Big GP Consultations. They tell us about what it is and how this is going to be relevant for Innovate and particularly our AiTs across the whole profession. To introduce themselves, I'm going to let them do that themselves because I always forget things and are awful at it. So if I can go first of all on my screen. So Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a GP ST4 in Cambridge, and I've just finished a leadership fellowship where I met the rest of the team who did this piece of work.
And next we've got Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob. I'm a GP ST3 based in Grantham in Lincolnshire, and similar to Rachel, I've just finished a leadership fellowship as well, which is where I met the rest of the team.
Okie dokie. So if you did have any comments or questions for us, let us know in the chat. We'll be definitely keen to hear what you guys are thinking about this project and stuff. But first of all, it'd be useful to know what the Big GP Consultation is. So do you want to fill us in on what it is and what you guys have been doing?
Yeah, so essentially there were a group of us. So we all undertook predominantly National Medical Director clinical fellowships last year, a few other different clinical fellowships as well. And a group of us that were GP trainees predominantly came together and really wanted to better understand from the perspective of trainee, so AiTs, GPs who were trainees, but also first fives, early career GPs, what the future of general practice should hold from the perspective of that voice. We recognise that actually often decisions about what the future of primary care might look like come from a very different cohort of GPs, those perhaps reaching more the end of their career. And what we wanted to do was to provide a platform and an opportunity for early career GPs, whether trainees or first fives, to come together and talk about the issues that face primary care and particularly general practice now in 2022 or 2021 as it was when we first were bringing this together, to really get that voice and understand what those early career GPs want, and to really then have an opportunity to relay that back to organisations like NHS England, like Health Education England, etc., and the college, to get that voice heard more, I guess.
Okay. And so obviously when you all met, you looked at this kind of project work and stuff. How did you go about looking at it and I guess assessing it?
So we sort of initially it was just a group that came together with a similar interest in what does our career look like. Lots of things are done to us as sort of junior doctors, and how can we make changes, and what would those changes look like? And it felt like there was a wave at that time of energy coming through about general practice and about what that future might look like. So we sort of decided that what we'd like to do is hold some consultations. We'd like to get a bigger voice together, and we could see sort of things happening around, and it was sort of partners or NHS England primary care teams making these decisions. And we were, well, where's our voice in that? Where's our decisions? This is our future, and it's quite a long future, and we want to be part of that. So we held 5 consultations, which we decided would be a good number, and we held them in the evenings after people have finished their work, across one a month, across 2021 to 2022. And we decided that sort of as a pull-in and as a sort of a hook, we'd use voices from general practice to do a 20-minute presentation, overview of the topic, get people thinking. We have people such as Martin Marshall or Helen Stokes-Lampard, etc. And then we had a bit of a Q&A with them. And then the most important bit really were these breakout rooms that we facilitated, which looked at areas that we felt were really important to really get to grips with how people were feeling about the situation now, but more importantly, solutions to make that a better future. Rather than sticking on the problems, how can we make these changes? And at the end of each sort of consultation, we would then put all that together and make a little report. And right at the end, we pulled it all together into our big final report, which we produced in September, and which we've been going around trying to socialise and also pick up with some of the bigger agencies to say, actually, when you're making decisions, we're a good voice to come to. Please take a listen.
Okay. So it sounds like a lot of work went into it. I guess key information I'd love to know, what did you find out?
So we divided into 5 areas, first of all, and that sort of became quite natural. So the first sort of topic was general practice in the wider health landscape. So it was the idea that sort of GPs sitting in their little room, well, actually, we're part of a much bigger system, ICSs, PCNs, but also part of trust, etc. And how do we fit in with that? The second area was about the evolving role of the GP. So, GPs now, we have a multidisciplinary team around us. We're part of all sorts of different working practices. And what does that look like? And actually, what are the benefits of that? And how can we utilise that better? We then looked at the role of GPs. So we are parts of society. What is our role, especially in the social determinants of health and health inequalities, and also in the environment and in climate change, etc. And then the really big one, developing the future workforce. So how can we make sure that we look at retention, recruitment, and what do they look like? And then the final one was creating a sustainable career, because obviously that's why all of us go into this job. We want a good job at the end of it, and how do we help sustain that?
Okay. So, I mean, there's some key topical issues there. I guess if we took them in terms of looking at some of them, the green agenda and that side of things, how did the information on that come through? And what were, I guess, the key themes that you heard from the different groups and stuff about how that's obviously clearly topical right now, but keen to know, I guess, what people were thinking and what you were looking at.
I think one of the things that really came out of that particular area is there's a lot of appetite amongst early career GPs to want to do more in that space, a clear understanding that it's important, that it is the future, and yet there's a massive mismatch between that and how people feel they're trained in that area, and the level of knowledge and I guess confidence that they have in then dealing with that. So people really felt that they didn't have the knowledge, skills and confidence to truly address their role in both what they do in their individual practice, whether that be, for example, around prescribing, and we often think about asthma, I guess, is the obvious place for that, but also in a more a practice level, thinking about how we reduce our waste, and thinking about single-use plastics, for example, recycling, even basics, and the fact that many people commented their practices don't necessarily get those things right, but they're not necessarily sure what they can do to help empower that. And then obviously there's the sort of bigger, longer term vision, and particularly the NHS England vision around reducing or becoming carbon neutral, and what primary care the role primary care needs to play in that, I guess, because of what a percentage of healthcare delivery we make up.
Okay. I guess health inequalities, we know, has had a massive light shone on it following the whole COVID pandemic, and obviously the way that we're heading into various challenges over the next few months and potentially years, with things like cost of living crisis and energy crises and that kind of stuff. I guess, what kind of focus was the work on health inequalities showing, particularly in terms of the project work, and particularly, I guess, how that's going to affect the trainees as they come through? Because I guess that's a challenging area to understand, and really broad as well.
So in terms of health inequalities, then massive focus during COVID, but it's been there all the way through. And I think, again, there was this understanding that it's important. And so GPs often are one of the biggest groups that get the concept of health inequalities. We do population health, and we often are going into people's homes, and we're part of those communities. So we understand that area better than most. However, this mismatch between what training looks like and what the realities look like is vast, and that again was an area where people were very much picking up that they just didn't feel ready to be able to deal with health inequalities and the social determinants of health with their patients, and there were lots of parts of that. So the concept of 10-minute consultations, how on earth do you get into how people are living if you're doing if you're doing an exacerbation of asthma and you've got such a short amount of time. So it was more than just not being prepared for it. It was also the structures around you that mean that actually health inequalities and social determinants of health require more time of you. And where does the role of a GP sit, and where does the role of rest of the multidisciplinary team, public health, and also local authorities, and that sort of then fed back into this whole concept of multidisciplinary team working, and where the GP sits in that. There was also a view of a bit of a postcode lottery in some ways of where you end up training. So how much of this do you see, are you exposed to at a time when you are more protected, versus when you see CT and you go out as a first five, where are you going to choose to train and to practice? Are you going to choose somewhere where it's more like where you've been before? Or is it going to be somewhere which is going to stretch you and maybe going to be a bit more complicated? And we know that if you're dealing with patients who've got lots of other complex social issues, working with that MDT, understanding the systems you're in is absolutely vital. If you haven't been exposed to that in training, that's quite a big step when you first step out in CCT. So there was lots of conversations really around those areas as well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the MDT teams, and I guess one of the things that obviously has happened over the past few years as well is the creation of PCNs, primary care networks, and particularly the additional roles, reimbursement staff, and that kind of stuff. Was there information that came out through the work that you did, or perspectives at the very least, as how that is impacting primary care, but also I guess with a view for how training is having an impact on that as well? So obviously there's an element of leadership and teaching and stuff that is part of the the curriculum and things, and supervision of these roles, working with these roles, that's definitely part of it. So I guess, is that something that you saw?
I think there was interestingly, it's one of the things, particularly ARS roles, were discussed in probably every single consultation on the different topics that we had. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that people are so enthusiastic about the opportunities they provide, but equally feel like, as you've just alluded to, that whilst there's an opportunity there around supervision and fulfilling some of those curricular competencies, actually most people, both in terms of trainees and particularly senior AiTs, but certainly first fives, felt that they were inadequately prepared to then undertake that role. And there was a lot of stress. In one particular conversation, several people shared stories of how challenging they found it supervising colleagues in practice as duty doctor, and that training really hadn't prepared them for that. But I think for all of those challenges and negatives, what really came through is that people see that MDT working in primary care overall is an opportunity. It's a massive opportunity for us to deliver better care to patients, and to do that in a way where the right person delivers care. It will be far more streamlined towards patients, and it facilitates better continuity of care. And I think that really came out, I guess, from participants, that they saw this as a real positive. And whilst there are those challenges, and that they didn't necessarily feel that they knew how to undertake that supervision that you just mentioned, that actually overall those roles were really going to make primary care a better place to work, but also that general practice is going to provide better care through having those roles. And I think similarly with PCNs, as you mentioned at the beginning, I think most people see this as an opportunity. Certainly people of our generation of GPs see these as opportunities to do things in a new way and in a different way, and that things have to change, and that we have to embrace these opportunities for working in different ways, and perhaps to some extent learning from the way that our colleagues in secondary care have done team working for a much longer time, but actually that works really well for patients. And immediately from my own experience, the emergency department springs to mind, that the MDT working in emergency departments often leads to better patient pathways, and we have a real opportunity to make the most of that in GP now.
Okay. If we were to go in a little bit deeper into that part then, so with the MDT working with the additional roles and that kind of stuff, was there much understanding of the depth and the breadth of the different roles within primary care as it is now? And if there wasn't, was there any, I guess, learning that you developed over this course, the consultations in particular, as to how people better understood that MDT working and the roles and stuff?
Yeah, so it was really mixed, and that again was down to the way that we train GPs. So some trainees only ever work in one practice throughout their ST. Other people obviously move around a little more. So it really does depend on where you end up and what other multidisciplinary team jobs that you're exposed to. And some people, knew loads about PCNs and all the different roles that are there and how they support, or how they could maybe support better, or how we could lead them better. Whereas others had very, very little experience of what else could be. And you ended up with GPs doing everything. And watching what that now looked like in that post-pandemic, post-living with COVID time, where actually GPs are massively under pressure and not having time to do all of the things that maybe we used to do. So how do we let go a bit? How do we push out those things? So rather than being able to say to patients, well, that's not my space, being able to say, well, I'm not the best person for you to be speaking to about this, but we've got somebody that we can, and I'm going to refer you to that person. But to do that, one, you need to have that person, but two, you need to understand who they are, what their role is, and how to refer to them. So it was a real mixed bag of whether trainees had that experience. And that was highlighted as just not good enough, especially now. We do an apprenticeship, and so we learn from our mentors, but our mentors may not have this experience at the moment. It's a really quickly evolving space. So how do we make sure that all of our trainees understand the MDT, understand PCNs, understand how these roles are developing, because in some areas they're really not there yet, but what they can do for you as a team, but then also vitally how on earth you lead that team and how you take part in it, because we're team players as well as leaders. We can't just take on all the responsibility, otherwise we may as well do it ourselves. We've got to learn how to be able to delegate and work with, a bit like a consultant doing a ward round. But we also have our own clinical lists and things as well, so we are a bit different. So that's why we ended up creating in our website, we've got a toolkit area, and actually there is an area specifically looking at the MDT, because this came up an awful lot about who are these people? How do I understand who they are? How do I work with them? And that was a real weakness. So we've taken that on, and we've put this area in our website for people then to have a look at and actually maybe try and develop a bit more understanding in their own area.
Okay. And I guess just to tie up some of that stuff you mentioned, obviously the working with the teams, it definitely came through in the earlier part that particularly the supervision of additional roles was an anxiety for some of the participants and stuff. What kind of learning came through in terms of that particular aspect? So, how to supervise, what are the processes people need to consider? You mentioned obviously exposure was a challenge for some people, whereas others it was possibly more prevalent and things. So was there information about that aspect of things, and if so, what and how?
I think one of the things that came out around that, I think it's a really good question, because actually there wasn't a clear answer. People didn't know how best to approach it. And I guess in our group of individuals, many of whom were still trainees, but even those the sort of third or so of participants that were first fives, it was an area that people really did struggle with. What I think one participant really beautifully summed it up in that the final year of emergency medicine training is largely spent on learning how to supervise the shop floor, including supervising other colleagues on the shop floor. And that if that's going to be a major part of the role of a GP, that time needs to be set aside during training to have proper development of that skill. And that, coming back to what Rachel said about the apprenticeship model, that needs to be done alongside someone, with spending time watching how someone else does it, talking about how they do it, and then slowly shifting it from being an observational thing to you doing it with support, to you doing it with feedback. And many of us just don't, in 3 years, many of us don't have the time to do that necessarily. By the time we've completed our AKT, by the time we've completed our RCA or whatever the assessment that follows that is, actually we don't have an awful lot of time left in training to then focus predominantly on what skills we've got left to develop that we need to be an independent practitioner on day one. And that actually making time to do that in a purposeful way is needed. And at the moment, training probably doesn't fill that need, and there's not a clear answer, because I think in reality GPs don't know how best to do it, because it's still new to quite a lot of our colleagues.
So I guess you mentioned time, you mentioned the length of training, you mentioned some of the key things that do often come up when we talk about general practice training in particular. I guess that had implications in terms of workforce and sustainability and various other aspects of the strands. I was going to say, yeah, you get what I mean. Going through this. So I guess, how did the length of training come through in this consultation work, and what was the view of the participants themselves in terms of, what would they like to happen? What should be looked at and what should be changed?
I think length of training is always one that's interesting. There are always people that go, 3 years is fine, do not want any longer. And then there'll be people that say, no, really, really don't feel that 3 years is long enough. And I think that debate will continue. And for as long as we need more doctors out there, I doubt there's going to be much, and also cost of training doctors. I think there'll always be pressure on keeping it as 3 years. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities. And there were lots of good ideas actually of how we could change, improve that. So things like actually that we need a core curriculum, but there should be maybe separate modules where if you're interested in that, you can have some time aside or time alongside to do those types of activities, or actually looking at fellowships. So we've been incredibly privileged. We've had a year out where I have, all of us have had time to look at how leadership works. What is a good leader? What is management versus leadership? How much time do we ever get to actually watch something, not from the point of the patient or from the point of the clinical aspect, but how did that person manage to get the outcome that was required? Or if they didn't, what went wrong and how could it be done better? And that's something that we simply just don't have time for. But we can have time for it if we look at things like fellowships. And there are so many more fellowships coming out. Again, it's area dependent. Some places have them, some places don't. But there are lots of fellowships looking at lots of different areas, from morality to health inequalities to leadership, etc. And I think, and we all thought, and that it came out of the consultation as well, that the idea of you can extend by looking at fellowship opportunities was a good one, but also massively, how do you support first fives? So if you're a consultant that comes out, then there's often quite good support around that. And there's often good CPD time, etc. But in GP land, there was a feeling that when you come out, then actually you're very much left in the ether. But actually there is, good evidence that if you have a good first five, if you have a good structure, the fellowships that you have, if they are well done and not just, we've got a fellowship, tick a box, then actually we can support and we can fill the gaps that exist in the training that we've got currently.
Okay. I guess with that, in terms of, you talked about making that part of the career, you know, the different opportunities, the fellowships, that kind of stuff. You're right, there's a breadth of them. I'm aware in my local area, we've got trailblazers, we've got mid-career fellowships as well, which is kind of cool. Not forgetting those that have, you know, gone through the first 5 process and stuff. But a lot of that speaks to the workforce challenges that we face in general practice. I mean, everyone knows about this, apart from possibly, I guess, the media and other aspects and things. But in terms of, you know, what did you find? Yeah, that's probably the best place to start.
I think, again, one of the things that sort of came out at every single stage was, if we could do better in every other area, that people would certainly not leave the profession as at the rate that we see people leave in various contexts. So I think that's point number one. If you don't, I think really the headline message is, if you don't prepare people for the job you then expect them to do, that contributes quite rapidly to burnout, which potentially leads to people leaving. So we need to do better at preparing people for doing the job. That said, even I think however well you prepare someone, the job is difficult. And I think we all see and recognise that the job is not easy. And it's not the same job that it was 20 years ago. Probably not the same job it was 10 years ago, if I'm honest. So there's got to be that preparation aspect, but we're not going to solve that issue quickly. And one of the things that came out that I thought was really interesting, we had a really interesting discussion about appraisal. And I bring it up only because I suspect most people don't think of appraisal as an opportunity. But the group discussion we had about appraisal was really positive as one of the things that actually is quite supportive, or has the potential to be very supportive. And we know it's appraiser dependent, and we know it's probably appraisee dependent as well, and it's about the relationship between the two. But having the opportunity to talk through things, get ideas, and be supported in that process is a really powerful thing, and is probably really necessary in our profession, perhaps more than other specialties, in the sense that we may well be more isolated, particularly depending on the kind of practice you end up working in, or if you go down the route of being a locum GP, that can be really isolating, and your appraiser actually has the really potential to help support you through that and look at options to keep you in. But I wish I could tell you that our participants had all of the solutions and they were X, Y, and Z, and that we could implement them tomorrow and it would solve our workforce crisis. But I don't think, we got quite that good a response, sadly.
Sure. I'd be very surprised if we managed to fix all the ills of the workforce for general practice in this particular session, and potentially even with the consultation itself. But I guess what I would be keen to know, was there any particular themes of stuff that came through that specifically were saying, you know, actually, if this is something, for example, a practice could change that would make us feel more engaged with wanting to continue either working long, you know, more hours, longer in the career, that kind of, I guess, you know, staying within the profession is probably a better way of describing it. Were there any themes that came through of things that particularly, I guess, you know, practices may not anticipate being really valuable?
I mean, there was a lot of worry that did come across of watching our colleagues, and especially the time that this was over, if you think about it, was also when general practice was very much in the media, and you know there were GP practices being attacked at the time, and we were very much the brunt of the abuse against the NHS. So at that time, as a trainee, you are living it. You're listening to the news when you go in, you're reading the newspapers, your colleagues are tired, they are burnt out, and you're thinking, actually, is this really the career that I want? And it's a short training, so there's not a lot of time to turn around ideas of culture and what this looks like for you. So the soup that we're training in is actually really, really important. And that doesn't mean that we should be lied to. It doesn't mean that people should be sugarcoating the career. And in some ways, actually, a lot of the noise was about, I don't feel trained for the day I CCT. So some people sit in a chair on one day, and the next day they sit in the chair as the salary GP with a very, very, very different job. and they don't feel prepared for that, and they in some ways feel lied to about what that actually looks like. So there was a really big focus on what the training is. So what should our VTS be doing? What should the college be doing? What should the curriculum really be looking like? What experiences should we be able to do? How can we maybe move boulders and say, actually, I need some time looking at rurality. I need some time in a rural practice, actually. So I want a month away from here. I want to be able to be flexible with HEE and say, it shouldn't just be like this. This doesn't work for us in this area. So it was about flexibility. It was also about, in some ways, us talking to power all of us and saying, actually, we need better representation. We need to make sure that people are understanding that we're not against patients and we're here for patients. And how do we have those conversations and ensure that we're not in that situation, as I was during the pandemic, with a patient sat next to me asking when I was going to start face-to-face consultations, going, I'm sure I'm not a hologram. So how do we create that narrative with our patient as well? But for practices, it's about a good practice involves their trainee. Their trainee is part of the ether. They are there. They're there to be involved. They're not service provision, but they are part of the team, and they are taught as part of that team. So, what does that practice want from their salary? What if they really think about it? Who do they want to sit in that chair? And they want somebody who's not burnt out. So if the training environment is knocking them out, then there is a problem. So how do they support them through training to make sure they've had experience of what the paperwork looks like, experience of the variety of patients, the experience of what does the PCN meeting that we go to look like? What is it to balance the books? What all of those aspects do we need to know? And making sure they're not just saying, well, the VTS program's there. Actually, it's their responsibility to take on and train the trainees that they've got for the workforce of their future. And that doesn't mean treating them like snowflakes or calling them snowflakes. It means really encouraging and saying, actually, this is an amazing job. We're all here because it's a good job. Let's make sure the future is even brighter. And how do we do that together?
So I guess you touched on a theme that is definitely there throughout the profession, in the sense that people feel that, trainees may not be doing the same, how do I say this effectively, same level of work, same commitment to the work. And, some of that is viewed, I guess, in terms of generational changes, the focus on work-life balance, absolutely, I think is part of it. What was there information that came through about that paradox, that conflict, I guess, and are there any solutions?
I don't think there was lots that came out around that. I think my initial thought that comes straight out, reflecting on like how I've been feeling this week, is actually the fact that I think what's often forgotten is that we have to go home and do our portfolio. We have exams, etc. So our view and commitment to the job isn't quite the same, but that's very much coming from my personal experience. And I suppose my disclosure is I'm sitting AKT next week. So that's absolutely why at the moment my focus has been elsewhere. But I think actually some of it, I do think our generation of GPs want different things, and that did come out. And I think one of the things where that came out is the partnership model the right model going forwards, which I guess doesn't directly answer your question, but I think there's parallels there in terms of how that fits and what's expected of partners in versus a salaried GP and what that time looks like. But I think we have to remember, I mean, even now, like we're in a very different place than we were a year ago from a junior doctor perspective, with the BMA obviously balloting after Christmas for industrial action again. I think actually our generation of doctors probably do see the world differently to the generations above us, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think we have to acknowledge that. And I guess to draw on what Rachel said, it's not about people being snowflakes or anything like that. It's just that we have different expectations, and whether that certainly my trainer would say that actually the job that we do now is infinitely harder than the job he did when he first qualified. And therefore, it's not surprising that people that are new to that and learning that job, actually, there is a limit to what they can do in that time. It is difficult. It's cognitively challenging.
Absolutely agree with that. And with the trainees I have, showing them and sharing actually the level of complexity we're currently dealing with is, logarithmically more complex than what we were dealing with, years before. And particularly the volume of that absolutely remains a challenge and stuff. I guess moving forward with a lot of that, then you mentioned one thing about the current challenges that are facing, in particular, trainees. We know that the BMA are currently doing various things in terms of what moves forward, and the whole concept of pay restoration is a key topical thing right now. Was there any comments around that during the time you did the consultation? I know, boy, it may not have been at that point, but what were the views that came through in terms of specifically pay from GPs and stuff?
So in fact, actually, pay wasn't something that massively came up, and that was timing. It was much more around culture and working conditions, and that was the media. So it was more that sort of phase that we were in than now. So yeah, pay didn't really come into it. It was much more around types of working, flexible working, the idea that there is no point attempting to take our generation and to pigeonhole them and put them into the old style, the old model, because it won't work. First of all, the systems change, the patients change, society's expectations change. We're now in the living with COVID era, and no one can remember how many years we've been through because time's warped. We're a different system, and we're also different people, and we've been trained in a different way as well. So actually, it's much more about rather than trying to fit our generation and our future workforce into an old pocket, change the pockets, take away the barriers and say, right, okay, what will work? How are we going to make this workforce really, really good? Because they are good. They've been chosen for med school. They've gone through the process. They've been selected. They are really, really clever, bright people. And they're not not good. They really are. So how can we therefore keep them in? Because if we try and we can continue to try to do what we're doing to our workforce, retention goes and recruitment slows down. And that is going to be the death nail. So we have got to work all together, partners, people retiring, the whole system through. We're not different. We're all part of the same thing. We need to work together to ensure that we can all stay in it. And that might mean there are phases where you do less, you back out, you do more maybe virtual stuff. And then there'll be times when you're much more present and you're much more in it. But that's okay, because we know if you look at careers outside medicine, it's no longer that you leave school at 16 and get your carriage clock at 65. That doesn't exist anymore. People actually portfolio all the way through. They jump out, they retrain, they go and do something else. And we've got to make sure that we're doing that with our own doctors. We are retraining. We are keeping them interested, keeping them involved. That takes effort, and that's not what we used to do. So it is a massive, great big shift, but it will pay, because we'll keep our doctors within the fold.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned portfolio careers. So I know we've got people watching us live. If they want to comment about their own careers and how that's had an impact, feel free to do so or ask other questions. But I guess with portfolio careers, that definitely came through in the theme of the kind of the consultation itself. What aspects did you feel came through from that, and what was the key things that people were talking about specifically about portfolio careers and stuff?
I think one of the things that's quite interesting there actually is that it was really, for lots of people, it's one of the reasons they became a GP was the opportunity to be able to do that in an easier way. I think one of the session where people talked about why they'd become GPs was fascinating for me, because actually there were some really core themes. One of them was about variety, and I think portfolio careers 100% speak to that desire for variety in the same way that the career does, generally. And people want different things from a portfolio career. I think that's one of the great things. People talked about wanting opportunities, whether that be education, whether that be leadership and management, whether it be doing something either a clinical special interest or coming back to health inequalities or greener practice or whatever that might look like, people want those opportunities. People want a diverse career. And I think it comes back to the challenges that we see. Being a jobbing GP is a really difficult career. And I think people want the opportunity to have those days where they do something different, because that maintains balance. We know it's good for things like burnout and reducing burnout. So I think that's a core thing lots of people want. It's a big draw to general practice. And I think actually we're missing a trick if we don't facilitate people to have those careers, because in reality, for lots of people, that portfolio career may be not that different to the number of clinical sessions they might work if they were a full-time GP, because in lots of cases, it's doing those things alongside each other. But I think by facilitating that's what comes out really, is that facilitating people to be able to do that in a way that suits them, and being flexible helps them stay in a career in general practice for longer, get more out of their career, both as a person and as a doctor. But they also bring stuff back. They bring stuff from whatever else, and it doesn't matter what else they do on that extra day. It doesn't even necessarily need to be in any way related to medicine. But what they bring back to that job as a GP is equally important. And we need to not shy away from the portfolio career anymore. And I think we need to increasingly normalise that's the way forward. That's the way that we're going to actually help solve some of our workforce problems, rather than the opposite.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's important to remember that probably many people have had portfolio careers, they've just not called them that, to be honest. And you know, the development and then the progression of that is absolutely something that's likely to happen and should happen within the profession. But I guess if we're looking at the focus of, fellow AiTs and that kind of stuff, how can they take what the consultation has done and apply that to their own practice? Is there any, I guess, guides or any information that you can share? And you know, where would you suggest they focus their attention on in particular?
So absolutely, like we didn't do this to sit in a silo and spill some hot air around. It's the idea that we want to make the point that we're not heard and we're not consulted, and actually we have a vital role to play in our future of our career, and we will move boulders because we need to ensure that we have a career to enter. So on our website, we've got an area called the Toolbox, and we really recommend people go there. So at the moment, there are a few categories in it, looking at leadership and management, looking at health inequalities or the environment. And what it does is it helps people think about an area that they might like to challenge, and they might like to look at where they can get resources to sort of better understand the area themselves. So it might have external links. It might take you off to do a bit of e-learning or whatever. And then it's got templates for emails that you can send out. So actually, lots of people will never have had contact with their PCN or with whoever, their GP school. How do you write an email to people that says, actually, I'd like to be listened to. I'd like to take part in this, and I've got some ideas. And actually what we found is that people really respond to that. We haven't had doors shut in our face. We've had doors opened and people have gone, oh, you want to help. That's really exciting. Let's bring you in. So actually, once you've done that, you often find that people will take you up on the offer. It's just whether you've got the headspace and the time to do it. So it's about using those templates, and then also about where you start. So it might just be, for instance, that you want to do maybe, most practices have a practice meeting, 15 minutes looking at the green agenda. What do we do? There's a carbon calculator on there where you can roughly look at your GP practice and see what it looks like. But also, as a trainee, this could help your e-portfolio. There's a leadership area in that. There are quality improvement programs that you need to do. So actually, this area would support you doing some bits of that, as well as start to develop your own ideas about what you want to do and what you think you need to develop further. But the biggest one is about trying to take yourself and trainees around you and the practice around you into looking at what we should be doing for our future. How do we, rather than say this isn't working for us, how do we say, right, this isn't working for us, we've got some ideas, we should share it. We should come together, talk about it, and then find a way, because it's always easier to do it as a collective than it is to do it as an individual. So how do you start up these conversations? And our draft emails, our PowerPoint presentations, etc., all on our website, but also our email address is there as well. So anyone wants to contact us and find out more information, get some support, find out if there's any more a particular area that they're interested in, we may have more information or more people that we can direct to and help create those networks. We're more than happy to hear from people.
Cool. So from that, I heard, that there's templates to help you approach different organizations. There's, suggestions of how to involve yourself within the practices to get more exposure to the variety of things that are in general practice. And even, looking at quip projects, that kind of stuff, hints and ideas and stuff, which I know definitely many of the AiTs are probably thinking, I need to do one. Yeah, great ideas there and stuff. And you mentioned the website. So where do people go to find all this amazing content?
So it's right there in the middle of the top of our website. So if you go to our website, which is the Big GP Consultation.co.uk, it's right there, right in the middle at the top. There's the toolkit segment, and all of this information is there. It will walk you tip around that is pick the area you're interested in, because there's going to be something in all of this that interests you as an individual. And if you're going to do work around it, and it's not always going to be easy to do this kind of quality improvement work, pick the thing you're interested in and run with it, because your passion and enthusiasm is going to be one of the things that gets you through doing it.
And is there any other place that you'd recommend people contact or follow the content that you've got?
So we've also got our Twitter. So our Twitter is relatively active. So please do follow us, but also contact us on our Twitter. And yeah, we will endeavour to get back to you with useful information.
Cool. So thank you, Rachel and Rob. It's been really useful talk, and I think there's lots of hints and tips in there about how people can look for their career in terms of the different aspects currently and moving forward. And yeah, that toolkit and stuff sounds really cool. I might even go look at it myself, to be honest, because there's definitely some ideas for me to think about for quip and all that kind of stuff that I'd love to look at. But also, what can I do in practice to help support my trainees more and the workforce? Because you're right, the workforce is the challenge that we all have to deal with, and the better we can deal with that, hopefully the better our own experiences will be and stuff. So yeah, definitely have a look at that. If the Innovate team want to have a look at other kind of content and stuff, I know that we've had another talk with some of the other members of your team that goes into a bit more depth of some of the other aspects, and that's probably coming up somewhere around here right now on YouTube, or definitely go listen to it on the podcast and stuff. And hopefully we've been able to help support you in terms of your independent learning and continuing to understand things with the Innovate podcast. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next episode. See you later.
Thanks.